I have told this story exactly 3 times in my life. Once to my attorney, once to my sister, and once to the therapist I started seeing 6 months after everything fell apart. Each time I told it, I started from the same place, the same Tuesday morning in March, the same kitchen counter, the same cold cup of coffee. But each time I told it, I understood a different part of it. The way you read a book twice, and the second time you notice all the things that were always there that you were not ready to see the first time. I am telling it a 4th time now because I think someone out there needs to hear it. Not the cleaned-up version, not the version where I was brave and smart from the very beginning, but the real version, the one where I stood at a stove making pasta carbonara for my son, while my entire life was dissolving around me, and I told myself to keep stirring. My name is Sarah. I was 46 years old when this happened, and I had been married to Daniel for 22 years. We lived in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, in a house we had bought together when our daughter Emma was 2 years old and our son Marcus had not yet been born. It was a good house, the kind of house that takes years to become itself, where the garden is finally the way you always imagined it, and the kitchen has been repainted twice to get the color exactly right, and the neighbors know your name and wave when you pull into the driveway. We had built that house into a home the way you build anything good. Slowly, with attention, one ordinary day at a time. Daniel was a regional sales manager for a medical device company. He traveled sometimes, not constantly, but enough that his absence on a Tuesday or a Wednesday was unremarkable, the kind of thing that had become so normal over 22 years that I no longer noticed the shape it left in the house. He was good at his job. He made good money. He coached Marcus's baseball team on Saturday mornings and grilled on Sunday afternoons, and sat across from me at dinner every night that he was home and talked about his day, and asked about mine with the particular warmth of a man who had never once given me a concrete reason to doubt him. That is the thing I want you to understand before I tell you the rest. There was no warning. There was no lipstick on a collar, no unexplained late nights, no sudden coldness or distance, or the 100 other signals that people describe when they talk about knowing something was wrong. Daniel was kind to me. He remembered the things I told him. He called when he was traveling. He held my hand at my mother's funeral and cried in a way that seemed completely real, and I believe it was completely real, which is the part of this that I have had to spend the most time in therapy working through. You can love someone and betray them simultaneously. You can grieve with them and lie to them in the same breath. I know that now. I did not know it then. I had been a paralegal for 18 years at a firm in downtown Columbus that handled civil litigation. I was good at my job the way quiet people are often good at jobs that require attention to detail and the ability to sit with complex information without panicking. I read contracts and depositions and financial statements the way other people read novels, with a kind of absorbed focus that my colleagues found either impressive or slightly unnerving depending on who you asked. I was not the kind of person who missed things. That is what made the subsequent months so difficult to process. I had not missed anything because there had been nothing to find. Daniel had been careful in ways that I could only fully appreciate after the fact. Our daughter Emma was 20 years old, and in her 2nd year at the University of Cincinnati, studying business with a minor in psychology, which she chose partly because she is genuinely interested in it, and partly because she said it helps her understand people, including, she told me once with a particular smile, her parents. Our son Marcus was 16, and the kind of teenager who exists in a state of permanent mild chaos, baseball gear in the hallway and half-eaten protein bars on the kitchen counter, and music playing at a volume that I had given up, trying to negotiate. He was funny and sweet and completely absorbed in his own world in the way that 16-year-old boys are absorbed in their own worlds, and I loved him with the specific ferocity that mothers have for their children who still need them in obvious daily ways. Our life was ordinary. I want to be very clear about that. Our life was ordinary and full and good, and I was not unhappy in it. I was not lying awake at night wondering where things had gone wrong. I was not filling a journal with grievances or counting the days until the children left home, or any of the things that the narrative of a betrayed wife is supposed to contain. I was making pasta carbonara on a Tuesday afternoon, and I reached for the wrong phone and everything changed. The phone looked exactly like mine. Same model, same black case, same dimensions, same everything. We had bought them together 22 months earlier at the Verizon store on Easton Way, standing side by side at the counter while the representative set them both up, and at some point in the months after that, they had become interchangeable in the way that objects become interchangeable when you live with someone for long enough that their things and your things stop having clear boundaries. The passcode was the same because we had never had a reason to have different passcodes. The year we got married. 4 digits that had unlocked 2 phones in our kitchen for almost 2 years, without either of us thinking anything of it. I had come home early because my 2 o'clock meeting had been cancelled. The paralegal, who was supposed to join me on a deposition prep, had called in sick, and the attorney I worked for, a methodical woman named Joanne, who did not believe in rescheduling anything without a concrete reason, had decided that under the circumstances we would move the meeting to Thursday. I had been grateful. March had been busy, and I was tired in the particular way that busy people are tired, not dramatically exhausted, but running slightly below full capacity, the kind of tired that makes you want a quiet afternoon and a cup of coffee and an hour without anyone needing anything from you. I made the coffee. I sat at the kitchen counter, which is where I always sit when I am alone in the house in the daytime, because the light there in the afternoon is exactly right, coming through the window above the sink at an angle that makes the whole kitchen feel warm. I reached for my phone. I picked up Daniel's. The first indication that something was different was the notification screen. There were 3 text messages from a contact that was saved as simply the letter M, no last name, no emoji. Just M. This in itself meant nothing. People save contacts oddly. My own phone has contacts saved as things like dentist office and Emma's friend Mia, and the name of a dog groomer I had used once and never called again. But something about the way the messages were stacked, 3 in a row, sent within the last 2 hours, made me pause. I told myself to put the phone down. I heard myself say it internally with complete clarity. Put it down, Sarah. This is not your phone. Put it down and drink your coffee. I opened the messages. The first one said she took her first real steps today. I caught them on video. I will send it tonight when she is asleep. I did not want to wait to tell you. The second one was a photograph. The third one said her name is Maya, and she asked for you this morning and I had to leave the room. The photograph was of a little girl sitting in a high chair. She was perhaps 2.5 or 3 years old. She had cake on her face from what looked like a birthday celebration, the kind of uninhibited mess that small children make when they are fully present in a moment of joy, completely unconcerned with how they look. She was laughing at whoever was holding the camera with her whole face, the way children laugh when they have not yet learned to do anything halfway. And she had Daniel's eyes. I know that sounds like the thing people say in stories like this, the dramatic detail that makes everything click into place, but I am not telling you this for drama. I am telling you because it is true, and because the truth is the only version of this story I know how to tell. Daniel has very specific eyes, dark brown with a ring of amber near the center, an unusual combination that I had noticed the first time I ever met him at a party in our second year of college, that I had told him about on our third date, that I had looked at across a hospital bed when Emma was born, and again when Marcus was born, and again when my mother died, and again at every dinner table, and in every ordinary moment for 22 years. The child in the photograph had those eyes exactly. I sat at the kitchen counter for a long time. I am not sure how long. The coffee went cold. The light through the kitchen window moved. My mind was doing something that I can only describe as attempting to find an alternative explanation with the same focused desperation that a drowning person looks for something to hold on to, working through every possible scenario in which those messages and that photograph meant something other than what they meant, and arriving each time at the same place. Then something shifted in me. The part of my brain that had been trained for 18 years to look at evidence and understand what it was looking at came online with a kind of cold, functional clarity, and I stopped trying to find an alternative explanation, and I started reading. I scrolled back, further and further. The messages went back 4 years. 4 years of a conversation between my husband and a woman whose full name I did not yet know, a woman he called by her first name, and sometimes by a nickname I will not repeat here, because it still, even now, produces a physical reaction in me that I am not interested in examining in public. 4 years of messages that told a story I had been living alongside without knowing it existed, a story that had been unfolding in the same city, in the same time zone, in some cases on the same days that I had been living my own story of an ordinary marriage in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. Her name was Rachel. I learned this from the context of the messages before I thought to look at the contact details. She was 38 years old, 8 years younger than me. She worked as an interior designer, which I learned from a message Daniel had sent her that said a client called about the Henderson project, and I told them, "You were the best in Columbus," which I know you already know. She lived in Bexley. She had been with Daniel for 4 years. They had a daughter named Maya, who had just turned 3. which I calculated with a precision that surprised me in the moment and horrifies me now, meant that she had been conceived in March of the year before, which was the same month that I had been sitting in a waiting room at the Cleveland Clinic waiting for the results of a biopsy. I want to stop here for a moment because I think this detail matters and I do not want to rush past it. I had found a lump in February of that year. My gynecologist had referred me to a specialist. I had gone to the Cleveland Clinic on a Thursday in March because that was the earliest appointment available, and I had not wanted to wait. Daniel had offered to come with me, and I had told him it was fine. I would be fine. It was probably nothing, and he had said, "Are you sure?" And I had said yes, and he had said, "Okay, but call me as soon as you know," and I had said, "I will." I sat in that waiting room for 2.5 hours. I read a magazine about gardens without retaining a single word. I watched other women come and go, some with husbands, some alone, some with friends, and I sat with my hands folded in my lap and I told myself it was nothing. It was not nothing. It was a benign cyst that required monitoring but no treatment, which the doctor told me in the kind of careful, reassuring tone that doctors use when they are delivering news that is better than the worst possible news, but still requires a certain amount of gentleness. I had called Daniel from the parking lot. He had answered on the second ring. He had sounded so relieved when I told him that the relief itself had made me cry, standing in a hospital parking lot in Cleveland with the cold air coming off Lake Erie and my husband's voice in my ear saying, "Thank God, Sarah, thank God." I have been going out of my mind. I had driven home thinking about how lucky I was to have a husband who went out of his mind with worry when I sat in a hospital waiting room alone. That was the same month Maya was conceived. I put Daniel's phone down on the counter and I picked up my own, and I took photographs of every message on his screen. I did it methodically, the way I do everything, working backward through the conversation, making sure I had captured every exchange that contained information I would need. Dates and names and addresses, and the kind of specific detail that makes documentation useful rather than merely painful. I photographed the contact entry for M, which contained a phone number but no last name. I photographed the apartment address in Bexley that appeared in a message about dropping off Maya's birthday gift. I photographed a message in which Daniel discussed an account at Huntington Bank that I had never heard of. Then I put his phone back exactly where I had found it. I went upstairs, I took a shower. I made pasta carbonara. I watched Daniel come through the door at 6:30 and kiss me on the cheek, and I said, "How was your day?" And he said the usual, and I said mine was fine too, and we sat down to dinner, and I watched him talk to Marcus about baseball, and I passed the salad and I said, "More pasta." Daniel, and he said, "Yes, please," and I gave him more pasta, and I thought about a little girl in Bexley with his eyes who was pointing at his photograph on someone else's refrigerator. That night, after Daniel was asleep, I lay in the dark next to him and I made a decision. I was not going to say a single word. Not yet. Not until I was ready. Not until I had done everything I needed to do to protect myself and my children in the way that I knew how to protect them, which was not by screaming and crying and demanding answers in a kitchen at midnight, but by being prepared. I had spent 18 years learning how people's lives come apart in legal proceedings. I had watched marriages dissolve across conference tables, and in courtrooms and in the lawyers' offices where I spent most of my working hours, and I knew that the people who came out of those proceedings with their lives still resembling something livable were not always the ones who were the most righteous or the most wronged. They were the ones who had been prepared, who had documentation, who had not allowed their grief to move faster than their strategy. I was going to be prepared. What I did not know that night, lying in the dark next to my husband while he slept with the uncomplicated ease of a man who did not know his life was about to change, was that Rachel had no idea I existed either. I did not know this yet. I would not know it for another 2 weeks, and when I found out, it would change the nature of what I had been building in a way I had not anticipated, because Rachel had been told something that Daniel had apparently been telling her for the entire 4 years of their relationship, a thing so simple and so devastating that when I finally heard it, I had to sit down on the floor of my sister's bathroom and put my head between my knees. He had told Rachel that he was a widower. He had told her that his wife had died 3 years ago, that he had 2 children, Emma and Marcus, who were being raised partly by him and partly by his late wife's sister, that he was still grieving, that he was not sure he was ready for a full relationship, that he needed to go slowly, and Rachel had waited. She had been patient and understanding, and she had loved him, and she had had his child, and she had spent 4 years respecting his timeline and his grief and his need to go slowly, because she believed she was in love with a widower who was doing his best. I was the wife who had died. I did not know any of this yet. I will tell you how I found out in part 2. But I need you to understand what it felt like to lie in the dark next to a man who had told another woman that I was dead, who had made me disappear so completely that he had constructed an entire parallel life on the foundation of my non-existence, who had looked at Rachel across whatever table they first sat down at together and decided that the simplest solution, the cleanest lie, the one that required the least ongoing maintenance, was to kill me. I lay there in the dark, and I thought about all the ways a person can be erased by someone who was supposed to make them feel more real. And I thought about Maya, 3 years old, pointing at a photograph of her father on a refrigerator in Bexley, asking where he was. And I thought about what she would one day learn about the circumstances of her birth, about the story her father had told to make room for her in a life he had already filled with someone else. And then I thought about what I was going to do about all of it. I did not sleep that night. But by the time the light started coming through the curtains, I knew exactly where to begin. The first thing I did the morning after I found out was call in sick to work. I had not called in sick in 14 months. Joanne, my attorney, was not a woman who responded warmly to last-minute absences, but she was also not a woman who asked personal questions. And when I told her I was not well, she said, "Fine, keep me updated," and hung up without ceremony, which was exactly what I needed her to do. Daniel left for work at 7:45 as he always did. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car back out of the driveway and turn onto the street and disappear around the corner. And I noticed for the first time that I felt nothing watching him go. Not the small, ordinary fondness of a married woman watching her husband leave for the day. Not anger, not grief, not the spiking anxiety that I had expected to feel after a sleepless night. Nothing. A kind of flat, clear emptiness that I would later understand was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something more useful than feeling. It was focus. Marcus had left for school at 7:15. The house was mine. I went to Daniel's home office, which was a room we had originally planned as a guest bedroom, but which had been converted so gradually over the years that it had stopped being anything other than his office sometime around the time Marcus started middle school. It had a desk and a filing cabinet and a bookshelf and a printer, and the particular disorder of a space that belongs entirely to one person and is never cleaned by anyone else. I had not spent significant time in that room in years. There was no reason to. Daniel handled the household finances, the investments, the insurance, the taxes. I handled my own professional finances and my own accounts, and I had always considered this a reasonable division of labor, rather than something to question. I understand now that this arrangement had been designed, consciously or not, to ensure that I did not have a clear picture of our financial life together. I am not saying he planned it from the beginning. I am saying that arrangements which benefit a person who is hiding something have a way of persisting. I sat down at his desk and I started going through things. I found the second phone in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, inside a manila envelope that was labeled hardware receipts in Daniel's handwriting. It was an older model than the one he carried daily, a phone he had apparently stopped using as his primary device sometime in the past year but had kept because it contained things he did not want to lose. I turned it on. The battery was at 31%. The passcode was different from the one on his regular phone. Not our anniversary year. Something else. Something I tried 4 times before I tried Emma's birthday, and it opened. He had used Emma's birthday to lock the phone he used to talk to the woman he had told that Emma's mother was dead. I sat with that for a moment. Then I kept going. The second phone was older in its content too, containing messages and photographs from the earlier period of Daniel and Rachel's relationship, before he had switched to communicating primarily through the newer device. It filled in the gaps in the timeline I had begun constructing the previous afternoon. I could see the beginning of them. The first messages, which were cautious and polite, and had the quality of 2 people who are being careful with each other, and I could trace the progression through the months, the gradual warming, the shift from careful to comfortable to intimate, and I could see the exact point, approximately 8 months in, where Daniel had told Rachel about his wife. He had not done it in a message. He had done it in person, and Rachel had written to him afterward, a long message that I read 3 times because I needed to be sure I was understanding it correctly. She wrote that she had not expected to feel so much. She wrote that she had not expected to fall in love with him, and that the story of what he had been through made her understand so many things about him that she had been trying to figure out. She wrote that she wanted to take care of him. She wrote that she was not going anywhere. He had replied the next morning, "I did not expect you either. I did not expect any of this." I sat in his office chair and I read those words, and I thought about what it would take for a person to look at someone across a table and say, "My wife is dead." To decide that the woman he had married, the mother of his children, the person whose name was on the mortgage and the tax returns and the life insurance policy, and 22 years of shared history. To decide that the simplest thing was to make her not exist, not to say I am separated, not to say my marriage is complicated, not even to say I am unhappily married, which would have been a lie I could have at least understood the logic of, but to say she is dead, she is gone, there is no one, there is only me and my grief and this space where a person used to be. I documented everything on the second phone, too. I was thorough. I am always thorough. Then I put the phone back in the envelope, put the envelope back in the drawer, and went to make myself breakfast, because I had not eaten since lunch the previous day, and I understood, with the same practical clarity that had been guiding me since the previous afternoon, that I needed to be functional and functioning people eat breakfast. I made eggs. I ate them standing at the kitchen counter. I looked at the garden through the window and thought about what I was going to do next. The attorney was the first step, and I had already taken it in my mind. I needed Patricia Cole. I knew Patricia's name from a colleague named Denise, who had been through her own version of this story 2 years earlier, a version that involved a husband who had emptied their joint brokerage account over a period of 18 months by making a series of withdrawals that were just small enough to avoid triggering the automatic notification threshold. Denise had come out of her divorce with more than she had gone in with, which she attributed almost entirely to Patricia, and I had stored Patricia's name in the part of my memory that keeps information you hope you will never need. I called Patricia's office from my cell phone that morning. Her assistant told me the earliest available appointment was the following Thursday. I said I needed something sooner and explained briefly why in terms that were specific enough to convey urgency and vague enough not to constitute a conversation. The assistant put me on hold for 4 minutes and came back and said Patricia had a cancellation at 11 on Wednesday, and could I make that work? I said yes. In the 9 days between that morning and my appointment with Patricia, I did 5 things. The first thing I did was open a savings account at a credit union in Dublin, which is a suburb of Columbus close enough to my office that I could stop there on my lunch break without it being remarkable. I deposited $2,000, which was the maximum I could move from our joint checking, without triggering a conversation about where the money had gone. I intended to add to it every 2 weeks until the day I needed it. The second thing I did was make copies of every financial document I could find in the house. Tax returns for the past 7 years, mortgage statements, investment account statements. The documents related to Daniel's 401k and the life insurance policy and the car loans and the home equity line of credit that we had opened 3 years ago to redo the kitchen, and which I now noticed had a higher outstanding balance than I had expected, which led me to pull the full statement and discover that there had been a series of withdrawals from that account over the past 18 months that were not connected to anything I had been told about. 11 withdrawals over 18 months, amounts ranging from $300 to $2,200. No explanations in the notes field. I photographed every page. The third thing I did was find Rachel's full name. I found it the same way I find most things I need to find professionally, through a combination of the information I already had and publicly available records. I had her phone number from Daniel's contact. I had her address from the message about Maya's birthday. I searched the county property records and found that the apartment in Bexley was rented under the name Rachel Ann Whitmore. I looked her up online and found a business website for an interior design company called Whitmore Interiors, which had a professional photograph of Rachel Whitmore on its About page. She was attractive. She had a kind face. She looked like the kind of person who sends their kids' birthday photos to the people who love her and trusts that those people are who they say they are. I looked at her photograph for a long time and I felt something that I was not expecting to feel, which was not hatred but something much closer to pity. The fourth thing I did was call my sister. Her name is Carol, and she is 4 years older than me, and she has been my closest person for my entire life, with the exception of the period in my mid-30s when we did not speak for 14 months over something that neither of us can now reconstruct with any accuracy. Carol lives in Westerville, 20 minutes from our house, and she is a school principal and the most practically competent person I have ever known. The kind of woman who responds to a crisis by making a list and working through it with a focus that other people find either reassuring or slightly alarming. She is also the person who knows me better than anyone on earth except possibly Emma. And when I called her on the 7th day and said, Carol, I need to tell you something, she said, I know, and I said, what do you mean you know? And she said, Sarah, I have known something was wrong since Christmas. I was waiting for you to be ready. I told her everything. I told her about the phone and Maya and Rachel and the second phone and the messages and the withdrawals and what Daniel had told Rachel about me being dead. Carol did not say anything for a long time when I got to that part. Then she said that son of a bitch very quietly, and I said yes, and there was another silence, and then she said, what do you need me to do? I told her what I needed. I needed her to know. I needed someone in my life to know the truth of what was happening so that I was not carrying it entirely alone. I needed her to be available on the day I sat down across from Daniel with my attorney because Marcus would be in school, but I did not want to be alone in the house afterward, and I thought I was going to need someone to come and sit with me in the kitchen while I figured out what the next 24 hours looked like. Carol said she would be there. She said she would clear her calendar. She said, I am so sorry, Sarah, and I said, I know. And we talked for another hour about things that had nothing to do with Daniel, about her kids and her work and a trip she was planning in the summer, and it was the most normal I had felt in a week. The fifth thing I did was the hardest. I found Rachel's email address on her business website, and I composed a message that I rewrote 11 times over the course of 3 days before I sent it. I want to be honest with you about my reasons for doing this, because I have been asked about it many times since, and the honest answer is complicated. Part of my reason was practical. I needed Rachel to know that the story she had been told was false, and I needed her to know it before the divorce proceedings began, because I did not want her to be standing in a courtroom in 6 months hearing about my existence for the first time. Part of my reason was something else, something harder to name, a feeling that Rachel deserved to know the truth about her own life, the same way I had deserved to know the truth about mine. She had a daughter. She had built 4 years around a story that was not real. She had a right to know. The message I finally sent was short. I told her my name. I told her that I was Daniel's wife. I told her that I had been his wife for 22 years and that I was very much alive. I told her that I had recently become aware of her existence and of my daughter Maya's existence. I told her that I had no anger toward her and that I believed she had been deceived in the same way I had been deceived. I told her that I thought she deserved to know the truth and that I hoped she would believe me, and that if she wanted to speak to me, she could call the number at the bottom of the message. I sent it on a Sunday afternoon, and then I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and went to watch a movie with Marcus, who had no idea that anything in our family was about to change, who was 16 and full of protein bars and baseball statistics and the ordinary beautiful self-absorption of a teenager who still believes that the world is a stable place managed by competent adults. Rachel called me 47 minutes later. I had not expected her to call so quickly. I had prepared myself for days of silence or no response at all, or a hostile message telling me that I was lying. I had not prepared myself for her voice, which was lower than I expected, and which, when she said, "Is this?" Sarah had a quality of barely controlled shock in it that I recognized because I had heard that quality in my own voice when I was alone in rooms where I allowed myself to make sounds. I said, "Yes, this is Sarah." She said, "Are you really alive?" I said, "Yes, Rachel, I am alive. I have been alive for the entire 4 years that Daniel told you I was not." There was a silence that lasted long enough that I thought she might have put the phone down. Then she said, "I have a daughter." I said, "I know. Her name is Maya, and she has her father's eyes." Another silence, longer this time. I waited. I had learned something in 18 years of legal work about the value of waiting in silence, about the things that fill silence when you give it enough room. Then Rachel Whitmore said something that I have thought about almost every day since. She said he told me she would have my eyes. I did not say anything for a moment. I was thinking about a man who could sit across from a woman he had been deceiving for 4 years, a woman who was carrying his child, and make a prediction about what that child would look like, knowing that the prediction was already false, knowing that the child would have the eyes of the wife he had told her was dead. Making the prediction anyway because it was the kind of thing you say when you are playing a role and staying in character matters more than telling the truth. I said, "Rachel, I need to tell you some things and I need you to listen to all of them before you respond." She said, "Okay." I told her about the messages I had found. I told her about the second phone. I told her about the financial withdrawals. I told her about my attorney. I told her that I was not calling to threaten her or to make her feel responsible for what Daniel had done, because I did not hold her responsible, and I wanted her to understand that clearly. I told her that I thought we both deserved to walk out of this situation with as much information as possible, and that I hoped she would get her own legal advice as soon as she could, particularly regarding Maya's paternity and the financial implications of Daniel's double life. She was quiet through most of this. She asked a few questions. She was not hysterical, and she was not cold. She was a woman processing an enormous amount of information in real time, with what I can only describe as a kind of stunned dignity. Before we hung up, she said one more thing. She said, "I want you to know that I never would have been with him if I had known. I want you to know that." I said, "I believe you, Rachel. I believe you completely." We hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a long time afterward, thinking about the two of us on opposite sides of a city, sitting in houses that a man had moved between for 4 years, while telling each of us that the other one did not exist. Thinking about Maya, who was 3 years old and entirely innocent, and who was going to grow up knowing a complicated story about her father that she had not asked to know. Thinking about Emma and Marcus, who were going to learn that their father was not who they thought he was, and who were going to need their mother to be steady while they processed that knowledge. I thought about all the ways this could go. I thought about the version where I was angry in a way that made everything worse, where I let my grief drive the proceedings and came out on the other side with less than I deserved, because I had been too focused on punishment to be focused on outcome. I had seen that version happen to other women across conference tables and in depositions and in the terrible quiet of attorneys' waiting rooms. I had watched women destroy their own cases by letting the wrong emotion lead. I was not going to let the wrong emotion lead. The day I sat down with Patricia Cole, I brought everything: the photographs of Daniel's messages, the copies of the financial documents, the printout of the county property records showing Rachel's address, the full statement from the home equity line of credit with the unexplained withdrawals highlighted. Patricia looked at the stack of documents I placed on her desk, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You have done my job for me already." And I said, "I have been a paralegal for 18 years. And she said, "That explains it." We talked for 2 hours. Patricia explained the divorce proceedings in terms I largely already understood, but needed to hear from an attorney, rather than from my own internal monologue. She told me about Ohio's equitable distribution standard. She told me that the extramarital relationship would be factored into the division of assets. She told me that the financial withdrawals were worth investigating further, and that she wanted to bring in a forensic accountant. She told me that Rachel and Maya's existence would complicate the proceedings in ways that were not necessarily unfavorable to me, because a court would take into account the financial resources that Daniel had diverted to a second household over 4 years. I asked her about Rachel. I asked whether Rachel's interests were in conflict with mine, or aligned with them. Patricia said that was a more nuanced question than people usually asked at a first meeting. And I said I have been thinking about it for 2 weeks. She said the honest answer is that Rachel's best outcome and your best outcome are not the same, but they are not opposed either. What Rachel needs is for Daniel to be held financially accountable for what he did to her, the same way you need him to be held financially accountable for what he did to you. A good outcome for both of you requires the same thing, which is an accurate accounting of what Daniel actually has. I said that seems right to me. Patricia said, "I think you should prepare yourself for this to be harder than you are expecting." Not legally. I think we are in a strong position legally. I mean personally. I mean there will be moments between now and the other side of this where you will not feel as prepared as you feel right now. And I want you to know that is normal, and not a sign that you are doing anything wrong. I said I have a sister and a therapist. She said good. Use them. I scheduled my second appointment and drove home and sat in the parking lot of our house for 10 minutes before I went inside, looking at the garden that I had spent years getting right and the kitchen window where the afternoon light came in at the perfect angle, and the front door that I had painted myself 3 summers ago. And I thought about all the things this house had held without knowing what else was being held simultaneously, 12 minutes away in Bexley. Then I went inside and started making dinner because Marcus was going to be home in an hour. And my son needed to eat, and I had things to do, and the pasta was not going to make itself. The night I sat across from Daniel at our kitchen table, with Patricia Cole beside me, and the divorce papers on the table between us, I had been carrying what I knew for 3 weeks and 2 days. He came through the door at 6:30 as he always did, same timing, same jacket, same face, and stopped when he saw Patricia and looked at me with the expression of a man who has been running for a long time, and has just understood that the distance between him and what he was running from has closed. I said, "Sit down, Daniel." He sat down. I said, I know about Rachel. I know about Maya. I know about the apartment in Bexley and the Huntington account, and the 18 months of withdrawals from the home equity line. I know about the second phone you kept in the filing cabinet, under hardware receipts. And I know what you told her about me. The last part landed differently than the rest. I watched it land. I watched his face do something I had never seen it do in 22 years. A kind of complete internal collapse, a man confronting not just the fact of being caught, but the specific nature of what he had done, the particular cruelty of having erased me in order to make room for something else. He said, Sarah. I said, Patricia is my attorney. The papers are in front of you. You can take them tonight, or you can have your own attorney call her tomorrow. But the conversation we are having right now is the last conversation we will have about our marriage. He looked at the papers. He looked at me. He looked at Patricia. He put his face in his hands. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside I could hear the neighbor's dog barking twice and then stopping. The refrigerator hummed. Patricia's pen clicked once against the folder. Then Daniel said something I had not expected. He did not say I am sorry. He did not say please. He said I told her you were dead, because I could not figure out how to make you not exist without making you not exist. And I want you to know that I know how terrible that is. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about what it means to be made to not exist by someone who swore to love you. I thought about Rachel, who had spent 4 years loving a widower who was not a widower. I thought about Maya, pointing at a photograph on a refrigerator. I thought about Emma, who was going to come home in 3 weeks for spring break and who was going to need me to be honest with her. I thought about Marcus, who was upstairs doing homework right now, who was 16 and who still needed his parents to be a stable structure around his life, even as that structure was quietly being dismantled. I thought about 22 years. Then I said, Daniel, the problem is not whether you know how terrible it is. The problem is that you did it anyway. He signed the papers 6 days later. On the 7th day, I called Carol and said, it is done. And she came over and we sat in the kitchen. And she held my hand across the table and we did not say very much because there was not very much to say that had not already been said or thought or cried through in the weeks before. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. I kept the house. Daniel moved to an apartment in Worthington, which is in the opposite direction from Bexley, which may have been a deliberate choice or may not have been. He began paying child support for Maya in addition to the support arrangement we had established for Marcus, who chose to split his time between both parents in the arrangement that many 16-year-olds choose, which is to live primarily with their mother and see their father on weekends and for major holidays and whenever they feel like it, which is an arrangement that I think is honest about how teenagers actually function in the world. Rachel and I spoke twice more after that first phone call. The conversations were not warm exactly, but they were civil. 2 women managing the administrative aftermath of a situation that neither of them had created, and both of them had to live through. She got her own attorney. She got what she was owed in terms of Maya's support. She moved out of Bexley, and I do not know where she went, which is the way it should be. Our lives had been connected by Daniel, and they did not need to stay connected now that Daniel was no longer the organizing principle of either of them. Emma came home for spring break, and I sat with her at the kitchen table and told her most of it, not all of it. There are things a daughter does not need to know about her father, if those things will not help her understand anything she needs to understand, and I applied that principle as carefully as I could. She cried. She was angry at him in the way that daughters are angry when their fathers fail them. A specific and complicated anger that has nothing to do with the practical outcome and everything to do with what the person was supposed to be. I held her and let her be angry and told her that her father loved her, which is true, and that his failures were not her failures, which is also true, and that she was allowed to feel every single thing she was feeling for, as long as she needed to feel it. She said, Mom, are you okay? I thought about that question for a moment. I thought about all the ways I had been asked that question over the preceding months, and all the ways I had answered it, and all the ways the answer had changed as the months passed. I thought about the morning when I stood at the kitchen window and watched Daniel's car back out of the driveway for the last time as a man who lived in this house, and I had felt something that I could only describe as a quiet, exhausted relief. Not happiness, not triumph. Just the particular piece of a person who has been through something very difficult and has come out the other side still themselves. I said to Emma what I believe, which is this. I said I will be okay. It is already true in some ways and it will be more true as time goes on. I lost something that I thought was real and it turned out to be partly built on a foundation I was not told about. And that loss is real, and I will carry some version of it for the rest of my life. But I did not lose myself. I did not lose you or your brother. I did not lose the garden or the kitchen or the afternoon light or the years of ordinary days that were genuinely what they seemed to be. I lost Daniel, and that is a real and significant thing to lose, but it is not the same as losing everything. Emma looked at me across the kitchen table, and she said, "I think you are the strongest person I have ever known." I said, "No, baby. I am just a person who had no other option but to keep going." And then I refilled her glass, and she refilled mine. And we sat in the kitchen until it was dark outside, and we talked about everything and nothing, the way you talk when you are on the other side of something hard. And the relief of being on the other side is still new enough to feel like something you want to stay inside for a little while. If you are still here, if you have listened to this whole story, I want to say something to you directly. Not to all of you at once, but to the specific person who recognized something in this story that felt familiar. The person who has been picking up phones and putting them back down. The person who has been telling themselves they are imagining things. The person who is lying in the dark next to someone who is supposed to be the most honest person in their life, and feeling the specific, cold loneliness of knowing that something is not right, but not being ready to find out what it is. You are allowed to know. You are allowed to be prepared. You are allowed to sit across from an attorney and say, "Here is what I have and here is what I need," and walk out of that office with a plan. You are allowed to call your sister. You are allowed to be devastated and strategic at the same time, because those two things are not opposites. You are allowed to keep making dinner while the world changes around you, because sometimes that is the only way to keep the world from changing too fast for the people who need you to be steady. And you are allowed to be okay afterward. Even when okay looks nothing like what you thought your life was supposed to look like. Even when the okay is quieter and smaller and more ordinary than the life you had planned. It is still okay. It is yours. Leave me a comment and tell me, at what point in this story would you have said something? Would you have waited the way I waited, or would you have confronted him that first night? I genuinely want to know, because I have never been sure that the way I handled it was the only way or even the right way. It was just my way. If you are new here, please subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them belongs to a woman who finally decided that her silence had lasted long enough. I will see you in the next one.